Hello everyone, this is Anjali and Amy, and today we'll be presenting on the article, The Political Rationality of Museums, written by Tony Bennett. Here is an outline of our presentation. We will explain the background of the article, a general literature and discourse overview to understand author's argument, and then we'll move into explaining about author's arguments and the relevance to our class. And finally, we'll end with a small activity. The author of the article that we're presenting today is Tony Bennett, who is shown on the photo on the left side. In the photo, he is a white Caucasian male of age with white gray hair and also white gray beard, and he's wearing a blue checkered shirt. So Tony Bennett is a British cultural theorist and sociologist who has written extensively on cultural studies, museum studies, and sociology of culture. He is one of the leading figures in these fields. The article we're presenting today, The Political Rationality of Museums, is a chapter in a greater work called The Birth of Museum, History, Theory, and Politics, which was published in 1995. And his other works include The Exhibitionary Complex, Material Powers, Making Culture, and Changing Society. Tony Bennett wrote the article, The Political Rationality of Museums, as part of his larger book called The Birth of Museums, which was published in 1995. The book cover is shown on the slide and features an image of a balloon-like structure that is constructed by TV screens on all its surfaces. During the time the book was published, there was a growing interest in understanding the role and function of museum in society, especially its influence on social and cultural domination. Bennett, in the greater book, explores the ways in which museums produce and control knowledge of and about the public. In his analysis of the museum, Tony Bennett applies the theories of Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher and sociologist. Foucault wrote extensively about the apparatus that supported the formation of the modern state, such as the prison, asylum, and the clinic. During Bennett's time, there was a growing argument amongst scholars of museums and culture that the museum was much like the apparatuses that upheld the power of the state. For example, Eileen Hooper Greenhill argued that while the museum is a democratic institution for public education, it was also one that disciplines and forms the civic person. Douglas Crimp argues even more harshly that the museums are complicit in perpetuating the dominant ideologies of their time, which homogenizes culture and historical representations. Bennett engages in a dialogue with his contemporaries and takes a more nuanced approach, arguing that the museum has multiple contradictory functions that makes its role more complex.
When describing museums, Bennett uses the term political rationale, implying that museums are shaped by political, economic, and social factors that decide their function and purpose. He cites Hooper Greenhill here and identifies three historical functions of museums. 1. Being an elite temple of the arts. 2. Being a useful tool for democratic education. And 3. Being a symbol of disciplinary society, a place where human behavior was regulated to become docile or submissive. Tony Bennett takes a more nuanced and critical look at the role of museums. He comments on the comparison of prisons and museums, saying they were similar in their act of enforcing discipline, regulating human bodies and behavior, and showcasing royal power to the public. For example, under the Renaissance time period, royal entry, the court masque tournament, and court ballet took place in museums. In addition, both prisons and museums have been called upon by the public for reform. People have demanded for prisons to rehabilitate prisoners and help them integrate into society, while demanding for museums to offer equal access and representation of different groups. On the other hand, museums differed from prisons in that museums allowed the interaction between different social and cultural groups. Unlike prisons, who separated prisoners from society, museums grew to remove their restrictions and become less exclusive and private over time. Bennett identifies two main contradictions of museums, the first being that although museums aim to be generally representative of humanity, in reality they oftentimes don't represent different cultures and communities equally or objectively. As a result, museums have been subject to politicization, as the public constantly demands from museums to adequately represent the cultures and values of different sections of the public. The second contradiction of museums exists because museums address people equally, yet variables like class, income, occupation, education, and culture can often form barriers that limit the participation of visitors and make them feel like they aren't welcome. Bennett makes many suggestions for museums to reform and improve. One of his suggestions includes allowing people equal access to knowledge, and in doing so, represent the power of knowledge to them as their own. Museums should not only focus on what is shown in its exhibits, but also who participates in them, and how this impacts the relationship between the museum and its visitors. In addition, the museum curator's job should be to help groups outside of the museum to use the museum's resources and share the group's voices. Bennett strongly encourages the concept that the public should have the right to make active use of museum resources in order to be active participants in the museum space. For example, on the right side here, you can see a photo of the Australian Museum's exhibition called Unsettled, which shows Indigenous peoples' founding of Australia. Tours of this exhibition are run by knowledgeable First Nations guides. First-hand accounts by contemporary First Nations artists are presented through historical documents, large-scale artworks, immersive experiences, and more. As mentioned earlier, Bennett cites one of Hooper Greenhill's arguments, in which she describes museums as a place, quote, where knowledge was offered for passive consumption. The museum became a site where bodies constantly under surveillance were to be rendered docile, end quote. Despite this, Bennett encourages the equal access, inclusivity, and openness of museums in order to increase active participation and engagement of museum visitors. As this article was published in 1990, it's important to note that museums have come a long way since then, but certain themes remain the same. Throughout this class, we have all shared some personal experiences in which we or others have felt restricted or out of place when interacting within a museum. As discussed this semester, ways to prevent this and instead promote inclusivity and active participation can vary from providing touch objects for visitors to access and interact with to consume information in a hands-on way. Including multisensory exhibitions can provide visitors with more than one way to understand the information shown in a museum and allows them to become more involved in the showcase. Also allowing different communities to contribute or criticize exhibits to call for more accurate representations of their histories creates a more open-minded and inclusive environment.
Thank you for listening, and now we'd like to go offline and start our mini activity.